My name is Rusif Huseynov, and today my guest is David Marples, Canadian historian and distinguished university professor at the Department of History and Classics, University of Alberta, Canada. He specializes in history and contemporary politics of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Professor Marples, glad to see you again. I hope you're fine.
Fine, thank you. Nice to be here.
Thank you. Today, our topic is the war in Ukraine, no surprise. Tons of articles and interviews are being produced almost on a daily basis, and they are usually designed to analyze political, geopolitical, economic, and or military dimensions of the conflict. Let us approach it a bit differently today and through the prism of identity issues. A day after Russia launched a full-fledged war against Ukraine back in February 2022, you published an article about Mr. Putin's obsession with Ukraine, and you explained how this obsession had eventually led to the invasion. Could you please tell us a bit more what this obsession all about, and why does Russian president undermine Ukrainian identity or statehood, or in general, separate Ukrainianness?
I think Vladimir Putin subscribes to a fairly outdated view of what Russia is and how Russia is constituted. And you could say that there are different images of what Russia might be. There's the Russian state, and there's Russia, or the greater Russian state, which traditionally might encompass other areas of the former empire, but in particular would include Ukraine and Belarus. And this is a version of the past that sees Ukraine as part of the East Slavic kingdom, going all the way back to Kiev and Rus. So the narrative would be that Kiev and Rus is a East Slavic state, and it's the kind of root state of the Russian people, Belarusian people, and Ukrainian people today. There would therefore be no separate independence movement of Ukraine until the 20th century. And then, according to Putin's version of history, which he's published online, particularly last year when he wrote this paper about Ukraine, is that in the Russian revolutionary period, the Bolsheviks created a Ukrainian state around 1920, which they then allowed to develop, and it becomes the Soviet Republic, and that this led to all kinds of problems. And he doesn't therefore see any prior manifestation of a Ukrainian state, ignores Ukrainian national movement in the 19th century in particular, when it was very strong, and doesn't see today's Ukrainian state as a valid state. It's something that was simply announced without any foundations, that it's got no history, no culture, and is even denied the validity of a Ukrainian language. So this is all something that is in Putin's head, and he sees therefore Ukraine as part of Russia. This is simply Russia's cultural past, if you like, foundations of Russia starting Kiev. Kiev is therefore like the mother of all Russian cities, and it's just something that is innate to Putin. I don't think every Russian thinks that way. They may think of Ukraine as a former Soviet fraternal nation or something like that, but Putin himself looks at Ukraine in a very serious manner, and I think he thinks ultimately it's part of the Russian state.
I remember some 5 or 10 years back, Vladimir Zhirinovsky, an eccentric Russian politician, would call the Ukrainian language an invention of the Austrians, which dates back to the First World War. And it's very surprising how this type of narrative, which would be mostly laughed at, then moved into the official discourse in the Russian elite. And you mentioned these three Eastern Slavic nations, Belarusians, Russians, and Ukrainians, who you happen to have been studying, and which, according to the Russian concept, are part of the so-called Russian world, Ruski Mir. Why is it hard for the Russian worldview to accept Ukrainians in the West, or to see them drift westward?
Well, I think
Why can't they simply let go of them?
I mean, there may be several answers to that question, but I think the Russian leadership sees the world from a very almost 19th century perspective, where you had a kind of balance of power in Europe and you had spheres of interest. And today, you might say that Latin America is still controlled to some extent by the United States through the Monroe Doctrine. In other words, the United States would not tolerate, let's say, a Marxist regime somewhere, or a regime that's perhaps supporting Russia somewhere. And this kind of concept also is followed by the current Russian state, which doesn't look at sovereignty so much as what is dangerous for Russia, what is going to affect the security of Russia, but also how you perceive the great Russian state. And this point of view sees the West as deliberately trying to undermine Russia since 1991. That is, the Cold War ends, but Russia recedes, NATO is enlarged and moves close to the Russian border, and you have color revolutions taking place in the early 21st century that see Serbia, followed by Moldova, followed by Georgia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, all having, sorry, not Kazakhstan, excuse me, Kyrgyzstan and Ukraine, where you have a president removed from power and replaced by a more popular figure, let's say, who's based on protests in the streets. And so there is that on the one hand, that Ukraine was seen as having a color revolution in 2004 with the Orange Revolution, and then the Maidan, which even more decisively formed a break with the past because they removed a president who was pro-Russian and instead had an associate membership with the European Union, and ultimately chose Poroshenko as a new president who wanted to go further to the West. So I can see that is on the one hand. I don't think that things like the enlargement of NATO, though, were the real reasons for the invasion. I never did. I always thought that the expansion of NATO in its current form, in the form where it came to the Russian border, was back in 2004. It was 18 years ago. I mean, nearly 19 now, of course. Why would Putin wait so long to respond to the expansion of NATO? Why would you wait for 18 years before doing something? More of a problem, I think, is where Zelensky's gone since he became president. Because I think in 2019, there was some hope in Moscow that with Poroshenko gone, Ukraine might sort of come back to the fold. Ukraine might start working with Russia, working with Russian entities, pull away from the EU. But in fact, exactly the opposite happened. And Zelensky not only followed Poroshenko's program, but he actually expanded it. And he started to shut down Russian networks, Russian websites, Russian newspapers. He arrested the most pro-Russian oligarch, Medvedev, who's linked to Putin in that Putin is the godfather child. All these things were happening in Ukraine. And he came to a point, I think, where he just sort of said, well, that's enough. We'll now change that and we'll bring Ukraine back to Russia. That's the way I sort of see it anyways, the reasons for the invasion.
Yeah, I see. And the formal casus belli, or at least one of them for this war, was a Russian ambition to denazify Ukraine. That neo-Nazis took power in Kiev has been one of the dominant narratives for the Russian side. Why is it important for the Russians to use this kind of justification? And do you think this narrative is designed for domestic audience or international for international public as well?
Well, it's certainly for a domestic audience, because I think the Russian public would need to be convinced of why it's necessary to have this special military operation against a close neighbor, and one where many Russians have relatives and where they've visited very frequently, to now suddenly be declared an enemy. You have to have a good reason. And if the reason is that, say, a group has taken power that is clearly linked to Nazi philosophy, I don't know how you define Nazi philosophy precisely, but you could say based on racism, elimination of groups based on their ethnic background. In this case, it would be, of course, Russians in the Donbass. But you know, it's hard for the Western world to understand this concept when none of the far right groups have ever held power in Ukraine. They've never had a president who was an extreme far right figure. The most they've had was when Svoboda got into the Ukrainian parliament, the Svoboda group, and had a handful of MPs, but they promptly were all gone again by the next election. And in the last election, who did you have? You had ultimately Poroshenko. You had several other candidates, you know, including a rock star and Yulia Tymoshenko as usual. But the main opponent was a Jewish actor who was Russian speaking, from Eastern Ukraine, seen on Russian television. In other words, in short, how could there be neo-Nazis in power in Ukraine? It makes no sense whatsoever. That's not to say there aren't any, because they're everywhere, and there are plenty in Russia. I mean, there are actually more in Russia than there are in Ukraine, that kind of persuasion. But Russia's chosen that, and is finding examples like the Azov Battalion and others where people carry these symbols and adopt far-right ideology, but they've always been a fringe group in Ukraine.
I see. We are no longer brothers. You probably recall this strong poem, which poem by the Ukrainians, which went viral in 2014 following the events in Crimea and Donbass. 8 years later, we have a new conflict, a bigger one. Do you think the Ukrainians and Russians are still brethren, or can remain as such from now on?
It'll take some time, I think, before Ukrainians regard Russians as brothers again, simply because of the way the Russian army in Ukraine has acted and behaved. Mass shootings of civilians, stealing, robbing, taking children away. All these things constitute crimes, and Ukrainians will no doubt feel now that it will maybe take a generation before we can trust these people anymore. And the Russians coming into Ukraine perhaps are a different breed. I mean, many are people who cannot afford to send their kids to college, so they're drafted. We know actually how easy it is to avoid the Russian military draft. If you can pay enough money to get into college, get your children out of the way. And this goes all the way back to the war in Chechnya, where you could see how Russians didn't want to send their kids to the army. So what is happening now, you get the poorest stratum, I think, coming, the untrained. They're hungry some of the time. They don't have enough food to live on. And they're looking, when they come into Ukraine, they're simply looking for goods, a lot of them. And they didn't comprehend why they were being sent there in the first place. Many of them just thought it was a military exercise and that they would be going home after a matter of weeks. So I think it's a war that's not unduly affected society in Moscow and Leningrad, St. Petersburg, say, where you get a much richer stratum of society and life goes on. They're not really affected by the war, and they're simply told it's a special operation and it's not a full-scale war. And I think that's a reflection of how the Russian leadership has wanted to portray this war to the people, that it's not really something long-term. It's just an operation against a certain group that's taken power in Ukraine. And I think Russian propaganda is quite powerful. You know, the social media, they have a very strong presence, have a presence in the West. They've affected elections in the United States, for example. And Russia's got some very powerful oligarchs And in fact, many of the Russian successes in the past few weeks have not come from the army anyway. They've come from private military companies like Wagner and the Chechens under Kadyrov, for example, and even Shoigu's got his own private military company as well. So, you know, this perhaps doesn't transmit itself back adequately to Russians living in Moscow and Leningrad, which is really the center of power. Unless things go really, really badly, you know, and there's a big call up and Russia goes into full military operation, then I think things would change.
I see. I see. Professor, the Russo-Ukrainian war involves Belarus to some extent. Perhaps the Belarusian armed forces have not fully been attracted to military operations, but Belarusian soil is used intensively for Russian attacks. The leadership in Minsk has openly sided with the Kremlin. How does this war influence the Belarusian identity?
Well, I think the Belarusian identity has been in flux ever since the elections of 2020, when you had mass demonstrations against Lukashenko that lasted for weeks and weeks. And eventually they were stopped by force, by a security forces crackdown. Thousands arrested, many political prisoners, many Belarusians leaving the country and not coming back. And those that did come back being arrested almost as soon as they get to the border. So Belarus is a society that seems to be in a perpetual state of terror, while you've got a group around Lukashenko wielding power, getting increasingly close to Moscow. You've got a population that is broadly sympathetic with Russia's campaign. And you've got maybe a substantial group that took part in the 2020 protests, but now has been silenced. So it's a very divided sort of society, but it's also at the moment relatively quiet. You're not seeing demonstrations, you're not seeing anti-Lukashenko protests and things of that nature on the streets of, say, Minsk or Brest or somewhere like that. What you are seeing, though, is a president who's much weaker, who doesn't really have a logical reason to continue. He's being drawn into the war slowly, but he's not yet released any troops. If he does release troops, he will incur the opposition of most of Belarus, because nobody wants to see troops from Belarus fighting in Ukraine. And oddly enough, the communication lines between Kiev and Minsk are still open. The Ukrainian ambassador is still in Minsk. Zelensky talks to him rather than to Sikhanovskaya's group or some other opposition group. So you're not seeing direct communication between Zelensky and the opposition. He's not supporting Lukashenko, but nevertheless, he's not sort of in league with the opposition, and that's creating a different sort of atmosphere. It's allowing Lukashenko a little bit of leeway so far. But the country is economically struggling. It can no longer export its most valuable goods to the European Union. It is drawn to Russia for energy needs, and it's drawn to Russia for its foreign policy. There's no distinction now between the foreign policy of Belarus and the foreign policy of Russia, official foreign policy. And I don't think that reflects the interests of Belarusians. They're divided, but they're peaceful. They want to be peaceful. They don't want to take part in a war. Ultimately, I think Lukashenko might be removed from power. He might leave power. There's not much really for him anymore. And he's changed the constitution. He's removed Belarus's status as a non-nuclear state. So now a Russian nuclear weapon could be placed in Belarus, theoretically. But all that simply binds Belarus more and more to Russia. And that's, I think, where they are right now.
I see. Thank you, Professor. This was all from me. Thank you for a great, informative session.
You're very welcome. It's nice to chat again.